Can I just, to say a couple of things in response to the last couple of comments, and tack it back to Lydia's question about what, why not Julie, and why this. It does seem to me, in terms of the last, say, 40 years or so of socially engaged artwork of various sorts, I think that there was such a huge narrative about community art and social engagement that was always about leaving the art world, and which Julie said last night. So it is that doing this is to leave the art world, and it's pretty obvious, but just to say it, this is a practice that is not leaving the art world to do that. And I think that, so with that, to me it seems slightly different than here's an artist who has a calling who became famous as opposed to another artist who has a calling who didn't. It seems to me about an attempt to link the fame part as an element in the practice, not that it isn't about seeking the approbation of the art world, finally I have recognition, but really more once one has the recognition and you're in this circuit, how would you deploy it? And that does seem like a very different kind of orientation on your world. I think another thing about when Lydia's saying, why is this working and what is producing these desires, I think that it's within that pretty strategic, worth knowing, noticing that he makes both material objects and immaterial experiences and events. And whether it's in the form of exploiting a racist moment or having a shoe shining gesture or interacting with a neighbor, those sort of things that can't be held onto in an object, next to objects that can be bought and sold. I also think that that's a huge part of how this art world thing is motored right now, but both this sort of desire to have something that's collectible and also the desire to have this experience, these experiences at places like Miami, Basel, the sort of lining up to have your shoe shined. And the cringe factor of those experiences are very much part of what art world biennials are marketing right now as well. There's cringing happening all the time at all of these sort of expanded visual art spaces that are making use of event-based work. I think that there's something, again, very sometimes quite cynical about those practices, and something quite transformative about those practices. But just to say that there's something about that fact that that's a big part of how things are motored. I will collect this object and I will have this uncomfortable moment that seems to be part of what is happening in an art world right now that he is exploiting. So.
Just a small correction about Julie. She mentioned that she exited the art world. That's not exactly true. If she was in that audience, if anybody black is in that audience, they're in that world and they're in that room because they're part of the art world. She is more well known as a literary artist. So those in the audience who were literary artists, they know her. Small correction.
That's interesting.
Sylvia, I think.
I just had to respond to you on that sort of cringing and the collectors having that cringy experience in their, nice spaces. It's a very palatable cringe to me. It's an acceptable cringe. It's okay. We can cringe a little bit, but we don't. And that's the part that I have that I'm still grappling with. He definitely plays to the very many different crowds, and he's a master. The work, and I'm sorry I stepped in here just a few minutes ago, so Julie's work, I Googled it last night, and did anyone talk about that? Oh, you did? Okay. But a very different kind of unpalatable work for a moment in time where, fetishistic, feminine, you look at that kind of work and you definitely sort of put it in a very specific place, outsider, and step away. At this moment, the whole outsider movement, fairs, the biennial. But for me, it's about that certain amount, that layer of palatability that is a little disturbing to me. And I still am trying to sort of work that through. And I don't know if I'll resolve it. I don't know if it is resolvable.
Why is it disturbing?
Because it's really kind of perpetuating a certain kind of marketability. Kavi Gupta Gallery is selling, works that look like Rauschenberg's, Gordon Matta Clark. It's a very sophisticated kind of work that he is showing in his spaces that has an art. I don't know if I'm repeating myself. That has a certain kind of art historical reference based on very male, very. It's a man's, it's a power privilege. It's a man's world. I mean, in many levels, art, look at art histories. And there was this woman last night who sort of, he talked about race, he didn't talk about gender.
To monopolize, but I do wonder about the gender component. I think about, how many people can list here so many different women who do this work. And he did talk about the thug self and the feminine self last night. I'm not sure what was meant by that. But there is a kind of caretaking that's associated with the feminine that is sort of normalized, but caretaking performed by men perhaps looks more radical.
There wasn't one point where he said he was listing.
Jane, can you give the mic back? Yeah, because it's the only way it's getting recorded, so it won't. We want to make sure we hear the.
Just to respond to that, there was at one point, I can't remember exactly what he was talking about, where he was listing like things in his life, and instead of saying wife, he said husband, which for me was an indication of some consciousness of that intersectionality of that issue, and his way of recognizing it without, again, kind of being overtly critical. I felt like, again, like the power of his work is like the undertones, the subtext, the what he's not saying literally.
I think that in terms of the cringe factor, it isn't, at least in terms of some of the venues and kinds of exhibition platforms that you were describing, there have been moments. I'm thinking about like the 1993 Whitney Biennial, which was all about art and politics and gender, and it was a very loaded thing, and it happened to have been a very explosive exhibition because people at that moment in time in New York City, I happened to have been living in California, and it seemed like old hat there. So it was sort of shocking to me that New York responded so violently in terms of critical takes on the show as being somehow, token, a lot of tokenism and a lot of problems with the idea of the quality of the artwork that was being shown. I mean, all of the kind of classic logics that had always been used to exclude people from exhibitions for so long. But the nervousness around bringing up very topical issues into a cultural sphere, into the white cube and on those levels. So, it is really interesting that was 1993, and here we are, 20 years later, and the cringe factor is operating differently now. There is a kind of desire. There is a kind of desire, I think, on the one hand, to confront those inequities, and yet not to necessarily really feel compelled to do anything about them or change them. In terms of like, maybe that's an overstatement, but I'm thinking about the collectors, the kind of the desire for having the cringe factor become institutionalized.
As somebody who's working in the philanthropy space, I think this is an interesting thing, right? Because a lot of people want to give their money away for very, not for cynical reasons generally, but for good reasons, right? Wealthy people think of them, and they think of themselves as good people who want to do good in the world, right? The question becomes, how self-aware are these people of their own power, right? And what is the role of the larger, in my case, the philanthropy business, right, to make that self-awareness manifest, right? And I think that what Theaster Gates is doing, and a lot of artists who are working in this space have the potential to do, is to actually, instead of representing the cringe or actually doing some of that work to make the self-awareness, which is necessary if we're actually going to make philanthropy or collecting or whatever. If that transfer of funds is going to work well, there has to be a sense of self-awareness at the top. And these engines, these cultural engines that happen on this level are really important. Yeah.
Is it on? I guess I wanted to say that I'm cringing a little bit at the cringe factor, that term. I feel like I wasn't cringing at all, that he's operating in a space that seems very familiar to me as an artist and as a African American. And I think what was affecting me a lot yesterday in the parts of the presentations that I saw, and not so much during Theaster's speech last night, but I think the kind of sidelining of race in the consideration of his work was making me extremely uncomfortable, actually, yesterday. And I think it might have been Tony Whitfield who said something towards the end of the last panel. But I just wanted to, I think that there's something. What was missing for me is the idea that race is, or what I would like to see, I guess, is race centralized. That's where it grows from in the work. It seems, to me, that seems clear, and maybe that's a projection on my part. And that these other aspects grow out of that, rather than the other way around, where it was feeling somewhat sidelined in the presentation and in the conversation about him, towards him, and I understand, why the term cringe was used, but in fact, as I said, it doesn't feel like cringing. It's like, this is the reality that so to kind of consume it as cringeworthy as a collector or in this other realm, seems like you can sort of buy that experience and then move on. You don't have to find Julie or anyone else. You've kind of isolated that to an event or an artist who you get that out of the way, and then you don't have to look further. So I'll leave it.
I'm just going to jump a little bit, but to get back to like the work that has been done that resonates. I think there's so many aspects to his work, and one that is huge is the whole notion of private property. And if you look back at certain works that have been done, it's often in houses. It's sort of like a memorial, and then it disappears, or it's temporary space. And I think that is something that is very different if you compare it to like Woman House or to Franceschini working with city planners and mayors and getting her Victory Gardens, and it's more of like a sharing thing of city space. And so that was just a reflection in terms of that. And then I think if you're constantly knowing, you preempt criticism through humor. I mean, it's like humor was huge in the work and in his persona, and wasn't really discussed yesterday. And I think it's definitely a way of navigating a bunch of worlds at the same time as you're being as critical as you can and want to be, but still staying in touch. And that's how I read his humor. It's one strategy among thousands of strategies.
I think just to jump on this one strategy among thousands of strategies, I was thinking about the cringe factor, and kind of wondering what exactly the cringe factor was around what exact part of Theaster's acting or his persona, if it were a performance that he had last night, as opposed to just being himself. And of course, there's a performative level to it, but I was thinking that some of the cringe is a fear of trickery and like an awareness of the acting and trying to unify the persona that Theaster is. And knowing him personally, as many of us do, we know that like any one of those things might be the reality, and so we try to pin it down, because if we don't know which one it is, how are we going to be critical? That humor point that you said, deflecting criticism. And I was also thinking about how you mentioned, Julie mentioned she left the art world, but maybe what Theaster did was that he didn't leave the art world. But he also didn't leave the university world, and he also didn't leave the bureaucracy of city government, and he also didn't leave his block, and he still lives there, and he still does the thing that he mows the lawns. And every one of those things demands and requires a different persona. And that acting is not acting, it's going through the world, like all of us do. So I think the criticality around cringe, Theaster foregrounds that acting, I think, a little bit more than some people do. But he doesn't divide it within himself as acting. I would just think that's who he is. And I was also thinking a little bit about the question of race being central, or the question of exploited systems not being visible. When you were saying that in the gallery, it's very easy to not see the things that are being exploited, possibly the structure of race. But to me, it's very present in the works, and the only thing that's hidden in the works in the gallery is Theaster's body. We don't necessarily see that he's black, or we don't necessarily see his acting. But the economies and the materials and the ecologies are very present in the objects. So I don't really see how it's hidden unless it's his body that's hidden.
I was actually going to say something about performance as well, but you've actually said that very eloquently. So I'll underscore one aspect of it. It seems to me actually that Theaster's performing in all these different contexts takes from a really deeply African-American system of passing. It's being able to pass in every single context with extraordinary effectiveness. Policy, art world. And so it actually is that ability to dissemble, to take on, dissemble not as in lying, but really the ability to put on and inhabit with complete facility and felicity those different selves at the same time. So it seemed to me to actually draw from a tradition of performing that is absolutely raced.
Most of my encounters with Theaster have been within the context of the Verla Center and the work that you've been doing with them, except for one. some months ago, I was at the board meeting of a foundation here in New York, and it's a fairly noticeable, substantial foundation that has been funding the work of the Rebuild Foundation and other aspects. And Theaster is describing the work, the practice, and talking about his various different selves, and is talking about the black monks and the singing. And one of the trustees, you know, a member of the family whose money endowed the foundation, said, "Oh, why don't you sing for us?" And he said no. And then just went on with his presentation. And that you talked about that whole performance, and he wasn't going to be exploited in that moment, and it really struck me. The other observation, going back to the beginning and where Lydia led us, about how do we use this as a teaching moment for students. You know, one of the things I was struck by yesterday's presentation by Theaster was his recognition of luck in his life, and he's humbled by it. He doesn't see, when he talks about calling, he doesn't see that calling as being selected or chosen. He sees that it's something very personal, that he's going to do the work that he's going to do regardless of the economic benefit that it's creating for himself. That's why he stayed in the west side, southwest side of Chicago, and is doing this work on his block. And I think that's the lesson really for students, is that it's not about the celebrity, it's not about the wealth, it's about finding that passion that, you know, makes you do the things that you want to do.
Hi. I have 2 points, and one in relation to his tactics. I thought that he had a really lovely list, and I'm going to put them out of order that he presented them. This would be my order: to listen, to learn, to imagine, to cultivate, to reconcile, to commit, and to expand. I just think that's just such a powerful statement to then expand upon and share with students, with other artists, and to follow on Kevin's statement about passion and commitment. I think we all have to remind ourselves how we can participate and what we're willing to commit to when there is no institution, when there are no friends, when your health is declining, when you have no money. Gramsci in prison, Antonio Negri in prison, a young artist who now is better known but not worldly known, Lin Yamamoto, when she had no space and no studio and no money, did the most remarkable piece of her entire career from my point of view. So I think, the least common denominator, we have to remind ourselves. And so maybe it's actually the formative movement of his career, the first 20 years, that are even more enlightening to this conversation than these most recent 4 years.
I think that these are really interesting points, and they really come back to that question of how does that then potentially get translated into thinking about how to prepare people to both, with astute, insight and skill, maneuver through multiple audiences. That's key, it seems to me, and I've heard that coming out across the room today. And then also, these other aspects of how do you determine the kinds of things that are core to your being in terms of your passion and your drive and your calling, as he described it. How do you begin to enable students or to locate that thing? And so I wonder if we could spend a little bit more time now in the remainder of our time together reflecting on how that is teachable. If it is teachable, what kind of tools we need for it, and how do you set up the dynamics of that kind of a teaching experience? So I wonder if people have reflections on that.
I think that's a good idea, but I wanted to just throw a wrinkle into it.
Okay.
Because I maybe am alone in the room where the idea of the calling doesn't work for me. It sounds, I mean, I'm 56 and I'm quite happy with my life and I've done many different things, but I would never describe it as being organized around this deep central passion that's singular called a calling. And so I just wanted to and so maybe we could just make that a bit of a problem too, whereas there might just be small needs that need to be responded to in sequence and and they're quite different each time and in different stages of your life and different places where you are and different, mostly I would say like what you see around you that you respond to. So so for me last night, I guess I was less favorably, I came away with a less favorable impression because the calling thing doesn't work for me and it seems a bit cliched. But then I learned from this conversation, because maybe what I heard as a series of cliches was more like an artful composition of cliches, and I just didn't get the artful composition of it. So I just wanted to put that in there.
That is so funny. Coming here, I was listening to also there's this song on the radio by some new band, and it's like believe, and I was like, that does not work for me like in that way. Yeah. And I was thinking the same thing about this cliche. But when the cliches are stated with complete sincerity,
yes, they change.
Very, very convincing.
So maybe if I could maybe pick up on what Lydia was saying about how do you make this a teachable moment or a teachable practice. One of the things that I have been doing in my courses, which is quite unusual for a scientist, and I'm not sure how many people are aware, there's something called Perry's model of ethical development. And to me, when I hear calling, I think you could take it as a belief and the belief muscle that Mark was talking about, that he himself talks about. But I also think that what he's trying to say is you have to find your own personal value system within the social values that are around you. And that in order to do that as a young person, as an 18-year-old, 17-year-old, 15-year-old, the only way that you can really do that, as Kate said, is to know the spaces that exist and the multiple points of view, whether they're race, class, gender, whether they're other notions of intersectionality. And so one of the things that you see often in young, like secondary, primary school is role playing, right? But often the role playing does not address the plurality within groups. And so one of the things I've been doing with this Perry's model of ethical development is thinking about how to place my students in the classroom so that they adopt different personas, characters, if you will. You said, he's performing these different characters in different spaces. He is, in a sense, representing different value systems. And that's what I meant by reappropriating. He is in these spaces, like for instance, a chameleon with intentionality. I'm here in the university, I'm going to operate with these rules, but I'm going to co-opt them for my own purposes. That actually are in line with my own personal value system. But it took him, maybe some time to find that personal value system. I'm sure he didn't wake up and, at age 9 have a calling. It took time. It took exposure. It took multiple points of view and finding his own system within systems. And so I think Perry's model of ethical development can be applied to any course. You don't have to, it's not a discipline-based model. And it's used in many, many places, and I find it works very well in my courses, which most people would not think have anything to do with ethics, but has deeply, to me, have a lot to do with ethics. So I would say that might be one thing as a useful resource for people to go and look at Perry's model of ethical development, because it also follows that list that you were talking about, because at the end you have to commit. But how do you know what to commit to? And it's that process that's actually more important than the arrival, right? So I just wanted to add that. I really like that list.
Just learning through the effort, I think, was an important point that he made, because we're bound to fail, and we're bound to feel shameful at times and humiliated. We don't always feel great about ourselves. So how can we move beyond those moments, and how can we accept that those moments will come, and it doesn't deny that there's something, beyond something to come out of it.
Just a follow-up question. Could you give an example of one of the role-playing exercises you do?
Right now, I have a role-play curriculum that is actually state-funded, so it's freely available to anyone. And it's on this notion of whether we should buy, or it's a little complicated, but it's about whether we should pay people for their human eggs in the context of stem cell research. So you might think, okay, as a scientist, you're going to have scientists represented in this role play. I make it very clear to pick 2 or 3 scientists who have very differing views. They're all scientists as their identity, but they do not have the same value system. I have different feminist scholars coming from within academia versus feminist activists who also don't share the same view, whether people should be paid or not. And this is a real issue when you talk about exploitation, right? There's an intersectionality notion to it as well. So I make sure that we have characters of different races, characters of different socioeconomic class, different backgrounds, different schooling. And so by the time it's all said and done, you have 16 people in the room who are really representative of the diversity around that particular issue. And I only give that issue as an example because it's very close to what I do. But you could imagine doing it with anything. But I would be lying if I said it's easy. It's taken me 3 or 4 rounds of literally implementing it in class to get the roles right. The first time I did it, I thought I had picked a great person to represent what I thought was inequity in structural systems, but the students didn't get it. So I realized that character didn't work. I had to pick a different character where it was going to be more overt, that their point of view is about structural inequity. So it's tricky for young people to adopt a character and get it right. And then what I do is I have them walk away from that character now that they've seen these multiple points of view, and now they have to arrive at their own committed position on the subject. And many of them say, I don't know where I sit at the end of this. And I say, that's okay, because the process to me is more important than taking that. If you're not ready, as a freshman to take a stance on this very political issue, that's okay. You have many years to come to that. But at some point, you may have to vote on it. You may have to decide whether we're going to publicly fund it or not. So, for instance, New York State is the only state that actually pays for this with public money in the world. So it's a very hot political issue. So I don't pick issues that are theoretical. I don't pick issues that are kind of hypothetical. I pick real world issues so that they recognize you can take a stand if you wanted to, if you felt comfortable enough. Mm-hmm. But you have to know all the different points of view. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that answered your question.
Katayoun, I think that's a really exciting model that you're using, and to hear that it's working is great, and to know that you're a resource for others to think through.
Many institutions of varying sizes and varying student body composition use it. So we know that it's not just new school, all the kids here are social justice oriented. It was at Vassar, we've used it at Vassar, we've used it at San Francisco State, we've used it at RPI. So many different institutions have adopted it and found it to be, the people at Vassar said that they had never seen their students work so hard on something, not for a grade.
That's great. Well, the thing that I was going to ask about that is that on the one hand, while it's dealing with real world issues, and it's something that they will in fact have to develop a standpoint around in their lives, I guess I'm wondering from a teaching perspective, at what point do you move it from the hypothetical classroom situation and have people actually learning in a project-based way in the world and really coming up against differences, and either through internships with socially engaged projects or through assignments where they devise their own proposals? And then, because one thing that I've been really struck by teaching here at the New School, I mean, we're talking, and I've taught also at public institutions where the tuition rates are very low, and there's a big difference in terms of what kind of who comes here and who studies here. And one thing in dealing with socially engaged work in the classroom, I've been really struck by the privilege of students and their inability to recognize their own privilege. So that maybe comes back a little bit to some of the cringe factor stuff we were talking about earlier, of just not when not understanding that there's an alternative in working in relationship to let's say the South Side of Chicago from a position other than pity or wanting to save those people. You know, it's a kind of colonialist pattern that's very deeply ingrained and naturalized and seemingly right from a philanthropic point of view. And so I think, you know, part of the challenge is I think it's great to play it out and to really make people conscious of it in the way that you're doing. I think it's valuable. I wonder too if there aren't more opportunities, and there are several projects already at play, but for project-based learning and for really mentoring people through and teachers also learning from that sort of engagement with real communities in the world, and how do we develop those alignments more as well? I don't know if I.
Students actually in that course went to Washington D.C. and talked to their congressional leaders and presented their work on the proposals.
Great.
And now we have a group that's actually thinking about going to the state and demanding that the state reverse its stance on payment. So I do.
So then it's about how to engage in a kind
in
of
the political
activist
space, but it is project based because it's
Yeah.
outside of the classroom. So my feeling is students have a hard time doing that if they don't feel very well informed. So the course informs them, and then they take the action. And I try to support ways to get them there. So whether that's through funding to take them to Washington D.C. or projects that already exist. For instance, there's the Debating for Democracy, where students can write a proposal and debate and bring that to their political leaders. So I think there are lots of ways to do that, and there's quite a bit of actually open funding for those kinds of project-oriented learning experiences.
I'm actually curious yet again of where, I mean, I was thinking of your list, and I think you opened it with to listen as one of Theaster's, because very often in these project or, you know, in certain kinds of things, there's a lot about doing. However humbly you may do it, it's about a lot of action and being able to have, and even in the context of thinking of work like Theaster's, other things as performative, it's the idea of performance as something where you're taking the stage, not as something, not as a performance where you are present in a position of learning again in a context where you don't actually know what's going on. That is performance as an act of, I don't know, an understudy or something where you're listening really closely. The kinds of things that, there's also a troublesome comparison that ethnographers sometimes face when they go into a situation where you think, oh God, I have no idea and I'm looking like a real fool, so I need to be very, very quiet and watch how everybody else uses their knives and forks so that I can get, you know, so it means being very quiet, watching and listening, and that too is a kind of performance or being an understudy or rehearsing or however you want to call it, but doesn't put people into the position of saying, oh, but I will contribute in this loud and center stage kind of performative way. So I'm thinking of how, I mean, and that goes back actually to my very first thought about breath and the things that are about sustainment and a kind of, they're quieter spaces, but they're essential. I mean, without them, there is really no bounce in the, you know, in the system, so to speak.
Can I respond to that? To Dorchester Projects are quiet spaces, like you describe. And for me, in my experience of them, they're far less about social justice in any way of action than they are in terms of listening. So it's really nice to hear you say that. Just to get back to the Dorchester Projects as opposed to the man. And I was thinking about these ways of acting and the role playing and so on. And I was thinking that in my experience of Theaster's expertise at that, one reason he's so good at it is that it's not a one-way street, that he doesn't just perform for other people or exploit these systems, but that he invites those people into his system. And he created Dorchester Projects as a place where that happens. And I'm in a way, it's kind of thinking about how when you are role-playing or being yourself in a particular system to use its resources, how are you not judging? Sometimes it's we think about social justice as we need to critically change this system sometimes, but maybe you need to put systems up against each other and let them change each other or being changed by them. And the amazing thing about Theaster is that when he engages with all these systems, as much as he's an activist, he's incredibly accepting. He's accepting of the collectors whose shoes he's shining, and he's accepting of the people on his block and everywhere in between. And he's accepting of the really, really critical feminists, and he's accepting of, all these people, and then they come together and he just sort of takes it all in. And so in a way, I think that that's what Dorchester Projects exists to do, to be, is that place.
That's interesting. In terms of teaching, I think that I think that a lot of times, when you teach somebody how to be critical, you wind up teaching them how to say no to things. And I think that one of the most interesting things that can happen here is an ability to be very critical in a way that says yes to things. That feels transformative.
Yeah. And two things that are related, but really about different parts of the conversation. One, just as a performance studies scholar, I just really appreciate how much the language of performance is being used, and especially the way that Kate's talking about it, because I don't think of performance as about artifice or trickery. I'll always quote the Victor Turner quote, "Performance is making, not faking." So I think that the even in cultivating in artists, I think there's so much about how often young artists are taught is about saying you have to have your core, authentic, true you, and then everything else is a compromise, and I do think that this is a different kind of orientation if you think about yourself as deploying a mode of behavior and a way of talking to be open to and change and be changed by the context you're encountering. I also do think, whether it's the discomfort with the calling or the notion of the cliche being said in a very sincere form, to me that's what's different about I'm just going to use the examples that are in the room, but the Miami-Basel moment of shoe shining, which could be just like a Santiago Sierra piece or some of these other discomforting moments, but then to follow it with let's talk, and to be sincere in the opening to talk, to me is shocking. It's kind of like to not be ironic at this moment is the most shocking thing you could do, and destabilizing thing you could do in this world where irony is so easily palatable right now. So anyway, I do want to say, and I guess I think it would be wonderful to have that dynamic be a central part of what it is to be training students. And then the last thing, to really bring it back sort of pragmatically, I think that a lot of times when we're talking about crossing worlds and crossing disciplinary forms, and this project has forced people to cross forms, I think that a lot of times people teach in counter to another field, in counter to those sciences, counter to those sociologists, counter to those data people, counter to those policy people. And this is a practice that is sort of saying, what if you're open to all of those other people that you often defined your field against, right? Next to another problem, which is I think so many interdisciplinary projects kind of poach the surface of another field and say, here, I'll take a keyword from here and here. And I think that this type of practice is sort of saying, no, you've got to go really deep in, and you have to learn the, sort of histories of philanthropy, or learn permitting processes or bureaucratic processes, and to get a deep, it's interdisciplinary practice that is not that is really about learning more than one discipline. So I think, I think that it's really quite a challenge in a university setting to give students something that is distinct and that has rigor, but not to do it in a way that defines it in opposition to another field when you're doing it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think those are great points. And I'm struck by that kind of deep dive that you're describing, Shannon, and the sort of exposure that allows the space for deep listening. It reminds me actually of another Vera List event that Robert Sember did here, who really, his whole thing is about the politics of sound and really beginning to teach ways in which you can engage in deep listening practices. But I'm, so many of these things are in fact spatial spaces that you need to create for that to happen, whether they're literally spaces of a forum like this that brings us together and gives us the time to have these encounters. I mean, because when you're talking about the adjacencies that you're describing, like where do we find those? How do we cultivate those? I mean, how do we have our own little kind of, Dorchester library moments or the listening room moments here at the university, or perhaps even across universities, since people are from different worlds here. And I was thinking also there's the space literally where people encounter each other, but there's also the space of a publication, to come back to that question as well, or the space of the internet where you have a website that perhaps, I don't know, I'm thinking, Katayoun, what you describe as those debates over a topic that come at it from different perspectives.
I never use the word debate because I think it speaks to what I heard you say.
Okay, yeah, the against. Okay.
We really are really intentional about the word dialogue.
Okay, great.
It gets back to this issue of you have to listen. It's not trying to win something.
Okay, so how do you make it be dialogical, right? Really, truly dialogical, where the questioning and the conversation is also about the self-criticality. But I'm wondering how do we take this experience that we've had for the last couple of days and think about what sort of a document, a book document, would serve the key points that we're describing as being so important to glean from these conversations and his practice and the Dorchester model itself. I mean, how do we position that? Who would the audience be? Who would we be aiming it to? And I don't know, Karen, if there are other things that you want to say about that, but I know this is a very real, very live conversation right now of how do you cultivate the quality of these key points in a publication form?
That certainly was my core question for today, but I wonder whether we should also consider matter and material and the objects of theasters, and whether that would be a way for us to train ourselves to look more carefully and to consider a book or the platform as an object that needs to be understood properly. I feel that we're speaking about this practice as a performance, as time-based, as encounters that happen at times, but what we didn't look at carefully enough is these objects that tell these stories and bear them in their material and are continuously renewed to our new and changing and evolving reading of these materials and the components that make the artworks, the objects in the gallery. So I now wonder whether the book, which we very much would like to do and are committed to doing, could have a shape where things are offered almost like Theaster's artworks that allow readers to access what is being offered newly and afresh each time they read the book. Don't know how that would be done.
I will just say that I was struck by how in the last couple of days, I mean, I'm an outsider. I don't know what the art world really is when people are referring to it, though I'm getting a better sense of it. It has a lot to do with collectors. And Anyway, but I was struck by how little was discussed about the works, and a lot more. I mean, I had a different experience than I don't know your name there, but yes, yeah. I mean, I agree with you. Race was sort of took slow to get out there, and but I also thought that it was more about performance and more about cultural ideas, and the materiality of this stuff wasn't really ever talked about. And I think Theaster discouraged that too, because he sort of said, "Oh, I like to do pots," and then someone else said something earlier about it's really just about the artwork is just for the I wrote it down. It's really just about the revenue flow. Yeah. So so I think that's interesting.
Really mean to just to reduce it to that, but I think that is a really challenging thing, because as much as I mean, there is the encounter with the material object, and Kate, you talked about how all of those pieces in the exhibition, for example, spoke, but I'm really wondering if that video hadn't been in the room with the objects, if they really would have spoken as eloquently or as loudly, because in this way, I think it's really hard to separate the material and the immaterial of a practice like his. And I actually think it's kind of, would be a mistake to, because it really is about the dynamic between how one both makes objects, the animation required to craft them, because craft is another thing we didn't talk about, which we could have, and I think there's a lot to say about it, but also the way in which, the framing of it, the dialogues that are generated through it are so much at the heart of what this work is about. So, I think it's our tendency to want to say there's the material world and the immaterial world. And Jane, I know you've written a book about those loose boundaries or those fluid boundaries. But I think that makes, that is the challenge for performance studies people too. How do you write about those immaterial exchanges or those dialogical moments? How do you set it up in that way that encourages the reader to engage on it more actively? So we are at, do you want to have a, please?
Another question of, those who are the faculty who so far who are here, or who, if you feel at all comfortable speaking, having talked to other faculty who went to Dorchester and have written some reflections that I at least got to read, and then you shared, and then shared yesterday. Like, part of me is wondering, what do you think of as the status of those texts? Next to Lydia talking about a possible publication. What kind of writing is that for you? And if you were to participate in a publication, how would you understand it? That's what I...
You mean the reflections of the faculty members who actually had attended the trip to Dorchester?
I know Karen is wondering about including them in a publication.
Mm-hmm.
What would that be to do that? Yeah.
So Kevin, Katayoun, Karateka?
What were you thinking? Yeah. Do you understand it to be journal writing, research, part of your research profile, part of your teacherly profile?
For me, it was journal writing. And I found it quite challenging. Karen knows. I found it very challenging to think about what is my response to this work. Because as an educator, I would have responded to it very differently. And I chose to respond to it as a scientist because I feel like science is never in the room. And I thought, well, if this ever does go out anywhere, good that science is in the room on a new school something. So it really speaks to, I think, what Kate was saying about, like, you choose. I think that's something that didn't come up here is when you do these performances, or whether you're not really faking but making, it is a privilege to have the choice to be the chameleon that decides how will you represent yourself in this space? How will you interact dialogically in this space? So for me, I decided I will treat it as a journal reflection, and I will reflect as a scientist. and I tried to read other people's to see, you know, is there a template? Is there a purposefulness to these collections? Do they play the same role? And when I read them, everybody's was really so different that I too am sort of wondering what becomes of these. I hadn't looked at mine for a long time. I looked at it, you know, this week, and I decided I actually liked it, and I gave it to my students, many of whom read it and said they found it very useful. So for me, it then turned into an educational tool, even though it initially was a journal piece for me.
I didn't see it as a journal piece at all. I mean, it was written and I revised it again, but I think I saw it as a way to use or to think through Theaster's work, but to actually ask some questions about our place here as in the university. So it was short, so there were actually some hard questions I wanted to ask about global expansion and so on. But I saw it very much as thinking about the politics of place of the universe, of us here. So it was for me very much about, in a way, a personal situated kind of interrogation.
And it connects to Karen saying, what's the role of a project that is out there, you know, for our community?
Here.
And you were making that bridge.
Yes, and I guess I should also say about performance, because I, like you, share that history in that, and I'm very cautious about it being chameleon-like, because I really think the space between the really real and the really made up is very, very narrow. So, I mean, that the things you embody, in a sense, come back and begin to construct you. I mean, I don't need to say that to people who've been thinking, but I think it's important to keep in mind that it doesn't mean a fluidity, and that's why I sort of alluded to passing, you know, because that has a very, very fraught and laden history in this country, but it means very much the ability to move and the sort of the absolute kind of rigidity of that ability to move as well, right? So.
Well, I know that we're at the 12 o'clock point here, so I just want to say that I hope that the kind of adjacencies that we've been having and sharing today can continue on. And I guess one place I just wanted to mention to those of you who are in the New School community, one place that I think that those conversations can continue is that we're developing a social practice minor that would be open to various practitioners, not only across Parsons, but theoretically across the whole New School. And I mean, it will be kind of based out of a fine arts practice, but really what we're looking for is the development of a community of multidisciplinary adjacencies, so that we can talk about projects that we're working on, projects that we find compelling, strategize a bit about teaching and pedagogical implications of all of this, and locate who those people are doing it and what classes already exist that could inform that minor. So if this is something that Noreen Letty has really been involved in, and I'm involved in, and so it would be great to hear more if you know of people, or to perhaps use that as one place where we could continue the conversations, as well as use the resources that will be available through the Vera List Center. So we're planning a retreat on the 15th of November, and if anybody is interested in being involved in those conversations, we're just about to put the word out on that. But it really is about as much community building amongst colleagues for those dialogical moments to persist and grow, as it is about literally curriculum building. So, good. Thank you all so much. It was really a beautiful exchange.